Hello, this is Professor Broker, and this is your Chapter 6, Lecture 3, Government Policies, Part 3 for Econ 231. Let's go ahead and get started. Remember, we're talking about government policies that alter the private market outcome, right? We talked about price controls, legal maximum price ceilings, legal minimums, price floors. Now we're going to talk about taxes, right? The government can make buyers or sellers pay a specific amount of tax on a per unit basis. But who will actually end up paying the burden of the tax? Can they legislate that? We're going to use supply and demand, the supply and demand model to evaluate these different policy effects, specifically on taxes this time. So again, why does the government levy taxes? Well, because we like things like, national defense, public schools, roads, things like that. The government needs to raise revenue, and so it does it through taxes. Now, it can attempt to make the buyer or the seller actually write the check to the government, in terms of the tax. But what we're going to look at is does that legislation actually, create a situation of where they're deciding who pays the burden of the tax? That's what we're going to talk about. Now, to make our analysis simple, we're going to be analyzing per unit taxes only, to make just that way the same analysis can apply to other types of taxes, but we're just going to be looking at, say, so for example, when you buy a pizza, let's just imagine there's, a specific dollar amount tax added to the bill every time you buy a pizza. That's a per unit tax. That's the kind of tax we're going to look at. The same principles and conclusions we draw, I think, will apply to taxes more broadly. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at a market for pizza. Let's just say in equilibrium in Murray, Kentucky, that we have an, again, upward sloping supply of pizza, downward sloping demand. Equilibrium price for a large pizza is $10, and there's 500 pizzas bought and sold on any given day in Murray. Okay, this is the market without a tax. Now, let's just say there's groups in Murray, maybe health advocates that want people to eat less pizza. So they lobby the city council, the mayor's office, and successfully get passed a law where they're going to charge every buyer of pizza $1.50 every time they buy a pizza. Okay, so they want buyers to write the check to the government and pay for the pizza. Okay, they feel good about accomplishing their goal because they obviously think that people will buy less pizza. Now, what we want to ask is, how will this $1.50 per unit tax on buyers impact our market? Well, I want you to think about our Chapter 4 analysis of our supply and demand curves. A $1.50 tax on every purchase of pizza, that would make buying or selling pizza less attractive. Okay, again, the buyers are the ones paying the tax. Of course, it would make buying pizza less attractive. In fact, it would make it how much less attractive? It would make it exactly $1.50 less attractive. That would decrease the demand for pizza, okay, shifting it down by exactly $1.50, right? In other words, for buyers to demand the same amount of pizza that they demanded before, 500, they would now require there to be a price, for the price to be $8.50, right? For them to demand 500 pizzas, because then they would pay the $8.50 for the pizza, and then they would have to send $1.50 to the government, right? And so that's the price they would require to demand the same amount as before, 500. Okay, so the demand curve will decrease by the amount of the tax. We will now have a new demand curve, okay, represented by this red D2 line, okay, that is the new demand curve for pizza after the tax, okay, again, because the pizza is now more expensive, okay, because of the tax. Now, the question then becomes is what happens in our market, okay? Imagine that the price is at $8.50, okay? We have a new demand curve, this red one. We have an old supply curve. The price here, imagine, is at $8.50. What would you tell me would happen in Chapter 4 at a price of $8.50, right? Well, you would have a quantity demanded of 500 at $8.50, but your quantity supplied would not be 500. It would be much less, right? In fact, you would have a shortage here. Well, what would happen in the case of a shortage? Well, the price would get bid up, wouldn't it? Until what? Until some new equilibrium. So we would have a new equilibrium point below the original equilibrium point. In this case, okay, it's equilibrium of 450 pizzas, okay, and a new price that sellers receive of $9.50. Okay, in other words, the new price on the sign when you walk into a pizza place, the price used to be $10. Now on the menu it says $9.50. Why? Because sellers recognize that there's less demand for their product because of the tax. Okay, now that's the price sellers receive. Okay, that's the new price in the market. That's the equilibrium price. But how much do buyers actually pay, right? They walk into the store, they get the large pizza, they put $9.50 in the seller's hands. That's the price sellers receive, which is less than they received before, by the way. But the buyer's not done. The buyers have to send how much to the government? $1.50. So they have to add $1.50 to their $9.50, making the effective price buyers pay $11. Okay? So I want you to notice that what the tax has done, the per unit tax has created a wedge between the price buyers pay, which is now the effective price buyers pay for pizza, which is $11, and between the effective price sellers receive, right, which is $9.50. Okay? And what I want you to notice about this situation is that the price buyers are paying is higher than they were paying before. Buyers are now paying $11. They were only paying $10. But the sellers are also receiving less than they received before. Even though the sellers aren't paying technically any of the tax, they're not sending any money to the government, they are receiving 50 cents less per pizza that they sell, okay, as represented between the difference of 10 and $9.50 now. And something else I want you to notice is that the size of the market has decreased, okay? And so this currently is the situation of a tax, right? A tax on buyers has created this market distortion. Well, let's think about, something. Frustrated that the new tax has adversely targeted buyers of pizza, a local consumer group decides to lobby the city government to get the tax to be levied on sellers instead of on buyers. Okay? And the city council quickly capitulates. They quickly switch the tax. They now want the sellers to have to send the money to the government rather than the buyers. They feel good about protecting the poor consumers of Murray. Okay? The question is what will be the end result impact of taxing sellers as opposed to buyers? Will it be different? Will it be the same? That's the question we want to answer. So now, the sellers are sending the $1.50 tax to the government. Okay, is that going to make buying pizza less attractive or selling pizza less attractive? It's going to make selling pizza less attractive because the sellers are sending the $1.50 tax to the government. In fact, it's going to make it how much less attractive? It's going to make it exactly $1.50 less attractive to sell pizza. It's going to make it $1.50 less profitable. Things that exogenous impacts that make selling or producing pizza less profitable. What did we say that would do to the supply curve? It would decrease it, right? Shifting it to the left. Okay, in this case, the supply curve is actually going to shift up by exactly the size of the tax, right? By exactly $1.50. The only way that sellers would be willing to supply the original quantity, the original equilibrium in the market of 500, is if they could charge $11.50 for their pizza. Okay, because if they were able to charge $11.50 for their pizza, okay, then they could, they would be willing to supply 500. And they would send $1.50 per pizza to the government and still be left with the original equilibrium price of $10. Okay, so they would require a price exactly $1.50 higher. The problem with that is that buyers might not be willing to buy pizza at $11.50 at the same level that they were willing to buy at $10. In fact, if the demand curve is downward sloping, we would expect at a higher price buyers to be less willing to buy pizza. In fact, in this case, at $11.50, we would notice with the new supply curve and the old demand curve that quantity supplied, would be greater than quantity demanded, creating a surplus. What would happen when there's a surplus? The price would get bid down to what new level? Well, the new equilibrium. Here where the new supply curve intersects the old demand curve, that would be the new equilibrium in the marketplace. Okay? And it would be exactly 450 pizzas, bought and sold. That would be the new equilibrium quantity. The new equilibrium price, okay, this would be the price on the sign. This would be the price when they walk into the pizza place. Buyers are now having to pay $11 for a pizza, whereas before they were having to pay $10, okay? It's exactly $1 more. That's the price in the sign. That's the new equilibrium, okay? But sellers, that's not what they receive, because sellers would get the $11 and they would have to send $1.50 of that to the government. So they would get to keep $11 minus $1.50, which would be what? It would be $9.50. That would be the effective price sellers receive after sending the tax to the government. Okay? Now, notice the difference between the price buyers pay, the price sellers receive is exactly the size of the tax. Notice that we still in this situation, have a tax wedge between the price buyers pay, the price sellers receive. Notice that the size of the market decreases as well, just like the tax on the buyers. In fact, what do you notice in both of these cases? It's the exact same outcome, right? No matter who we legislate the tax on, if the sellers, right, have to send the tax to the government and the supply curve decreases, or if the buyers have to send the tax to the government and the demand curve decreases, it doesn't matter. We end up with the exact same result. Buyers paying a higher price, exactly $1 more than original, and sellers receiving exactly 50 cents less per pizza. It doesn't matter who sends the check to the government, and the size of the market decreases in both cases. Okay? So a tax does a few things, right? A tax reduces the size of the market, which we see as the equilibrium quantity going from 500 to 450 in this case. Okay? Buyers and sellers both pay part of the tax. They both share part of the burden of the tax. This is called tax incidence. Okay? Tax incidence is how the burden of the tax is shared among market participants. And the really key thing is that the government might try to tax only a certain segment of the market. They might try to tax pizza sellers, but that they can't prevent pizza buyers from not being affected. They will be affected. When they tax a market, both sides will be affected, no matter who is technically legally responsible for the tax. The elasticities and the shapes of the supply and demand curves will distribute the burden of the tax according to the laws of supply and demand. Okay, and that's the important key here. Okay, it's very crucial that we understand that it's the same in both cases. Now, what the tax incidence is how the burden of the tax is shared. Well, how is it shared in this particular case? What would the tax incidence be? Well, again, buyers originally pay $10. Now they're paying $11. So buyers are effectively, regardless of who sends the $1.50 to the government, buyers are effectively paying $1 of the tax. 2/3 of this tax buyers are paying. Okay, even if it's a tax legislated on sellers. And sellers are exactly how much worse off? They were receiving $10, now they're receiving $9.50. So sellers are effectively paying 50 cents of the tax, 1/3 of the tax that is, even if the tax is legislated on buyers. Okay, so that is the tax incidence in this example, and it's the same regardless of how we legislate the tax. Now let's look at this example. The price paid by buyers after the tax is imposed. Okay, so here we have original equilibrium, the original demand curve, the original supply curve. Original equilibrium is here, $14. After the tax, this would be the new equilibrium. We would take that up to the original demand curve. This would be our tax wedge. Buyers would effectively pay $18 after the tax. Sellers would receive $8 after the tax. The size of the tax is obviously $10. The size of the market would reduce from 80 down to 60. Okay, so again, it says the price paid by buyers after the tax would be $18. Okay, same market. What is the amount of the tax per unit? Well, again, it's this tax wedge here. And it would be 18 minus 8, or $10 would be the size of the tax. And finally, the per unit burden of the tax is, and again, you compare the price buyers pay after the tax, 18, to the original price they paid of 14. Buyers are paying $4 of the tax, and sellers would be, they used to receive 14, now they're only receiving 8, so $6 less. Sellers are effectively paying $6 of the tax. The answer that says that is A. Okay, so this $10 tax is distributed through the forces of supply and demand as $4 of the tax is paid by buyers, $6 is paid by sellers, even though you can tell that the buyers are the ones having to send the check to the government, okay, because the demand curve shifted. Now, what determines tax incidence then if it's not the federal government or the state or the local government? That's a good question. Effectively, elasticity that we talked about in Chapter 5 is the economic force that distributes the burden of the tax. So let's think about in a situation where supply is more elastic than the demand curve. The demand curve in this case is fairly inelastic. Supply is fairly elastic, right? If we put a tax in this market, who's going to pay a larger share of the tax? Okay, well, we can see here that the new price buyers pay would be much higher than the original price they paid, whereas the sellers would be receiving relatively, not very much less compared to what they received before. The burden would be unequally shared by the buyers as opposed to the sellers. Okay, the buyers would have a larger burden, and this makes sense if you think about the fact that supply is relatively elastic in this case. Elastic means that sellers can more easily leave the market. If they can more easily leave the market and a tax is imposed, what are a lot of sellers going to do? They're going to leave the market. That would leave the relatively inelastic buying side of the market, the consumer side of the market, left paying the tax, because if buyers have inelastic demand, then of course they can't leave the market as easily, and therefore they would be stuck paying most of the tax. Now let's reverse it. If demand is more elastic than supply, then the exact opposite would be true, wouldn't it? The same size tax would create a situation where the sellers would actually have a larger burden, a larger tax burden compared to the buyer's tax burden, right? And again, this would make sense because if demand is elastic, that means that buyers can effectively leave the market more easily than the sellers could. That's what elastic means, okay? And again, the side of the market that's more elastic can more easily leave the market and therefore will pay a smaller burden of the tax, whereas the side of the market, supply or demand, that's more inelastic, that side of the market is going to be stuck paying most of the tax because by definition they can't leave the market. Now, let's look at a case study of this, okay? The luxury tax, which was passed in 1990, signed by the first President Bush. It was adopted. It was a luxury tax on yachts, private airplanes, furs, expensive cars, etc. This was to raise money for the federal government. Now, obviously, this tax was designed to impact who the most? Obviously, the rich, right? It was meant to raise revenue from those who could most easily afford to pay from wealthy consumers, because only wealthy consumers would buy luxury yachts, private airplanes, and so on, right? And so that was the goal. Again, it was legislated on the buyers of these things, but does that mean that it was the buyers of these things that paid that had the largest burden of this tax? Well, let's look at it. Well, let's look at what we might predict the effects of this tax would be. Okay, the market for yachts, right? We might anticipate that the demand for yachts is relatively price elastic, right? I mean, think about it. If I have millions of dollars and I'm looking at buying American-made yachts, then that I could, and I probably do that for recreation, for leisure. I could probably spend my millions of dollars on foreign-made yachts or on other types of recreation activities, right? Going to a private island, for instance, flying, and so on. Going and spending my money on other things, for recreation, right? Going golfing, for example, and to exotic places and things like that. There's lots of different ways I could spend my millions of dollars, if I'm rich, on recreation other than buying a yacht. We might anticipate the demand is relatively price elastic because it's a luxury. But what about the supply, right? In the short run, you might think about the suppliers, the factories of yacht makers. And again, if I needed to switch my yacht manufacturing plant to making, bubble gum tomorrow, that's probably going to be difficult to do. In the medium to long term, maybe I could do it, but I mean, all of my machinery and all of my workers are trained to make yachts. And so switching productions would be difficult in the short run, making my supply relatively inelastic. Therefore, if we put a tax on this market, who would we anticipate to pay the larger burden of the tax? How would we anticipate the tax incidence to be distributed? Well, if supply is inelastic and if demand is relatively elastic, then sellers are going to pay the majority of the tax, not buyers, not the rich buyers, but the sellers. Well, let's think about this. The sellers of yachts, of course there's going to be, yacht manufacturers and there's going to be owners of those corporations, but there's also going to be workers at the yacht manufacturing facilities. And do you think the workers making the yachts tend to be mostly wealthy or even middle class or maybe relatively low income? A lot of these workers are probably either lower middle class or even potentially low income. And so if the sellers are having to pay a larger share of this luxury tax, right, which they most likely would, and many of these, yacht manufacturers have to go out of business, who is disproportionately affected? The rich buyers, or maybe the middle income or low income sellers or manufacturing workers of yachts? Well, of course, it would be the sellers. It would be the manufacturers who would suffer the most. And that's exactly, to be honest, what happened in this case. This luxury tax was quickly repealed because what quickly happened was the yacht industry in New England was decimated, and it was middle income and low income workers who ended up disproportionately negatively impacted by this tax, not the super rich. And we can understand this simply by understanding elasticities and tax incidence. Okay, so again, markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. Market economies use prices to adjust supply and demand. These prices serve as signals and create valuable incentives surrounded by information, or sending information and creating incentives for both buyers and sellers. And when we tax a market, or when we institute a price control in a market, we might have very good intentions as the government to try to help people, but oftentimes we create unintended consequences through these policies that distort the market and can sometimes hurt the very people that we're trying to help.